Right. So, in this session, I'm going to talk about language learners using Twitter. And obviously, as a communication tool, language learning, it is a space where Twitter is very relevant because you can connect with many others with similar interests. So, I'm going to talk about in general, Twitter for language learning, and then the research I did with language learners and how they use Twitter for language learning and what they think about it. So, Twitter can be really useful for language learning in terms of being able to connect with people who tweet in the target. The target language is the language you're learning, basically. So you can follow newspapers, news outlets, anyone who tweets in the language you're learning. You can tweet in the language you're learning yourself. You can form a community with other learners, and there's many practices like word of day, many links to resources and useful infographics that that teachers and what's the word I'm looking for? Universities, schools, etc. Tweet to help language learners. So, in terms of research on Twitter for language learning, it was quickly identified as a subject that obviously, as a communication tool, was very relevant to language learning. People quickly identified that you could use it to access exposure to the language, for comprehensible input and comprehensible output and meaningful interaction between Twitter users, and about engaging and participations in communities of language users. There have been some studies on Twitter for language learning, which were all kind of very positive. I'll let you have a quick look at what we found there, including participation, improving the language, improving communication between students and between teachers and students as well, forming communities, learning not only about the language but also about the cultures around those languages, so how people do things or the history, etc. So there's been a lot of stuff, but a lot of it has been quite small scale and has been reporting on teacher-led activities, so where teachers ask their students to go and do this or that on Twitter. And there's not been much research on how language learners use Twitter independently of their teachers as a non-formal learning activity. So I wanted to know, who uses Twitter as a language learning tool, what they do, how they use it, and what they think about it, and about how useful Twitter can be as a tool for language learning. So what I did is I created a survey with 30 questions. I wrote it in English, French, Spanish, and Italian to try and capture as many people as possible, because it was about how people learn on Twitter. It was developed through Twitter and shared through Twitter. So this was one of the tweets I sent. Are you learning a language? Do you use Twitter? Please take this survey. As you can see, this one had about 117 retweets, so getting people engaged in sharing it. So I obtained 401 responses. Very few replies to the Italian one. Maybe my network doesn't have that many Italian teachers or learners. French, English, and Spanish are broken down right there. So, of those 400 people who responded, 63% were male, 34% were female, which is not particularly surprising because language learners there's an overwhelming majority of females in language learning in general. If you look at students at university setting, for example, you get a lot more women than you get men. And as you can see, a good range of ages among those who responded, which fits quite nicely with the ages of people who use Twitter anyway. So I asked them what language they were learning, or to choose one if they were learning more than one. As you can see, Spanish, German, English, French were the most popular ones, but there was a range of many, many others. So there was also a good range of levels in the language and how long they'd been learning the language. As you can see, most people had been learning the language for over 5 years. Which, you know, if they're using Twitter independently, they're perhaps less likely to be beginners who can only say a few words. So that kind of makes sense. About a third were still studying formally, and then the rest were learning informally, or no longer actively studying, but still interested and using the language. And 84% were not living in an area where the language they're learning is the main language. So, for example, learners of English that do not live in an English-speaking area. Yeah. So they've been using. Most of them had been using Twitter for quite a while, so they were experienced users. And I asked them how they use Twitter. So we had those who tweet regularly and read tweets, tweet regularly but hardly follow any accounts, rarely tweet but use Twitter to follow others, mostly as a private communication tool, hardly ever use it and never use it. So from here on, I removed these people from the survey to look at their practices, because these people who use it for private communication or hardly ever use it, I wasn't particularly interested in, because I wanted to focus on those that do use it and how they use it. So for the rest of the results, those people were removed. So the number was actually 379, if I recall correctly. As you can see, those who use Twitter use it very often and mostly from a mobile device, although quite a few of them still use a desktop computer or laptop, and spend around 10 minutes with variations of how long they spend on Twitter at a time. So this was the kind of one of the biggies. So do you ever tweet in the language you're learning? A quarter never ever tweet in the language they're learning. Don't forget that there were some beginners in here, so obviously less likely to do so. I haven't done the analysis based on language level yet. This is the overall picture, but I think it will be interesting. I dare say that a lot of the nevers are probably related to level, rarely, occasionally, and often. So we have over 40% who do it occasionally or often. And I asked them why, after this question, why they tweet or not tweet in the target language. So as you can see, the answers really change depending on they never do it, they rarely do it, they occasionally do it, or they do it often. So lack of confidence is a big thing for those who never or rarely tweet in the target language, whereas it's not really an issue for those who tweet often. Not being good enough at the target language, again, has that diminishing value. Simply do not tweet. I just kept that because they included it. Some of them cannot see a reason to do it, although not many. have no followers who use the target language, so their environment, their network is mostly in their own language rather than the target language. And as you can see, this really decreases among those who tweet often, because obviously their network then will be growing among those who use the language because they are tweeting in the target language. To communicate with other target language users, as you can see, those who never already do it, hardly ever do this, but it is a very popular reason for those who do. Again, the idea of fun doesn't particularly enter these people, and it is more popular here. To practice the language is the obvious one, so those who do it more often score a lot higher in terms of getting practice. So, yeah?
If you don't mind, what is the does not tweet in target language mean? Because you have people who say they're often tweeting, and that's a reason. That's what I was a little confused about.
I know, that was just kind of like a controlled part, so I'll probably remove this from the final analysis. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but I did want to include it as...
So some people who said that did it often in target language then later chose,
yes,
I don't do it.
So I'll have to tweet that when I do the final analysis, yes.
It doesn't make sense that they did it. I see.
Yeah. So apart from tweeting in the target language, I asked them what else they do. So they read tweets in their own language about the language they're learning. They read tweets in the language they're learning written by native speakers, but not so much written by fellow learners. Follow language learning institutions, providers, professionals who tweet language learning resources, follow native speakers, or access resources. Okay, so you can see the ones that score lowest are where the tweets in the target language are coming not from native speakers, but from fellow learners. This is something that in language learning you come across very often. Basically, you say to students, talk among yourselves, and they say to you, but I don't want to learn mistakes from my partner, I don't want to, I want to practice with native speakers, and say, well, yes, but we don't have enough native speakers, and actually, talking amongst yourselves is actually a very useful part of learning, but students don't see the value in that in face-to-face classes, and obviously it replicates in the social media aspect. So, do they focus on the meaning, or do they focus on the language? I really wish I hadn't put both in there, because it would have given me a much more precise answer to this. But most people focus on both, which is a good thing, because you do. This is based on the idea that obviously, as you're exposed to language learning, you learn because you notice things about the way the language is constructed by reading other people's production in the output in the target language. So I said, did you ever learn any new vocabulary that you noticed in a tweet? A lot of people feel that they've learned new vocabulary, and they provided loads of examples. Some people didn't provide an example because they made the very reasonable point of saying, I know I've learned some words, I just can't remember which, because how often do you actually remember where you learned the word? They know they've done it, but they can provide an actual example. But about 150 people did provide actual examples. Not so much for learning grammar rules, so they're paying more attention to the meaning rather than to the form of the language. A lot of people say that they've learned facts about the areas where the language they're learning is spoken, and this is mostly current affairs and politics, history, education, entertainment, then art, sport, environment, work, all sorts of topics that they're learning about. This is normally learning that is not found in in many language learning books. You don't find current information about those kind of topics. So the learners are supplementing that kind of information from their Twitter activity. I was really interested in the concept of forming a community of of practice, something that teachers tend to do a lot on Twitter, but learners not so much. Most of them say that they haven't formed a relationship with other people, with other language learners. A few, 15%, do kind of agree with what you normally define as a community of practice with a joint purpose and activity, and just people I can obtain interesting information from. So they're very practical about it, and they're more interested in the native speakers than they are in fellow learners and supporting one another. So of course concerns were an issue. Do people have any concerns about using Twitter as a language learning tool? I was very pleasantly surprised to see that actually 30%, the most popular response, was that they didn't have any concerns about using Twitter for language learning. A few, 9%, had some issues about privacy, but most, just 7% mentioned exposing themselves to abuse or negative tweets, and most of them then talked about the actual language learning process and are worried about the eternal thing when you're learning a language, exposing yourself to the world if you're making a mistake when tweeting in the target language, and learning wrong language from other learners. So the final kind of wrap-up questions were, do you agree that using Twitter has improved my knowledge of the language I'm learning? Very positive responses in general, strongly agree, and agree, making up, what was that, 63%. Then either agrees or disagrees, but very, very few people disagreeing or strongly disagreeing. And we see a more positive level of agreement with 69% the idea that using Twitter has helped learners learn about the areas where the language is spoken. So we've been able to, with this research, been able to see a bit of a profile of the kind of people who are using Twitter as an independent language learning tool, with a variety of ages and gender, whether they're formal or informal learners. We've seen that they use Twitter often to support their language learning activity, very happy to receive input and read input in the target language, less happy to produce input in the target language, which of course applies to language learning in general. People are happy to, in a sheltered way, listen to something or read a text. A lot less, it takes a lot more courage to actually produce language in the language you're learning. Positive beliefs about the learning experience, mostly vocabulary and cultural information, very few concerns. So basically the conclusion is that Twitter is a helpful tool for language learning and engagement with the culture and native speakers or the target language, less so with other learners. That's me. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.